Gwe ni Deluisi Naiomi Metallic garu Deluisi Naiomi Dlewit Listiguch garu Wigichi Bukduk. Well, Dasi Begisin Giskok. I'm very happy to be with you today. And my name is Naiomi Metallic, and this is my friend.
Great, Nindeluis at Gibu Beganji, Cheryl Simon, Deluit, I say Dartmouth again. Budamugadic, Epigotnowich. So my name is Cheryl Simon. I have to be here, and my family is from PEI. And the word that I just remembered was that because I live in Dartmouth, and that is the place of the tom codfish, and that is a fish that's harvested in the wintertime, in January, February rather.
There you go. So Sarah asked us this afternoon if we would do something to talk a little bit about our work in Indigenous law revitalization, and Cheryl and I have combined forces before, and so the two images on the screen sort of represent both we both do work in this area, but it is a huge area, and we do complementary work, but on using different resources of Mi'kmaq law. So, for example, well, Cheryl will talk more about her basket work, but she does all kinds of harvesting work and basket work, and she works with quills. So that is, this is a basket that she made that represents some of the stuff that she does. Mine is a book that I published of my father's writings called Mi'kmaq Heritage Notes. I work a lot with stories and resources, as well as language resources, which my dad worked with in the Mi'kmaq language. In the brief time that we have, what we hope to do is to provide you just a little teensy bit of an introduction to Indigenous law revitalization work and a few different methods that we are working with to draw out Mi'kmaq law. And, you know, I question whether to call it environmental law specifically to kind of put those kind of boundaries around it, but it will certainly touch on our relationship, Mi'kmaq relationship with land, with animals, and birds and other species as well. So we will touch on some of those issues. Okay, to get us started, I want to, and Cheryl will, I'm gonna go first, sort of setting some groundwork and doing some background, and then Cheryl is going to take it over sort of halfway through talking about some of the stuff that she does. I don't know how much you are familiar that there is, you know, a growing body of scholarship and work happening in Canada and beyond in revitalizing Indigenous peoples' legal orders, so different nations' legal orders. And just to even give you a little bit of background on that, I mean, I have a class where I teach this and we spend a lot more time on, you know, the theory of what is law, but to kind of give you sort of the, you know, just a big overarching sort of view of what is Indigenous law. Like when I do these presentations, we're thinking about law or a legal tradition as, you know, what it is people do in order to live together and with the environment around them as well. So it's our concepts of justness, fairness, and peace. And it's an intergenerational conversation which allows a group of people to problem solve together, make decisions together, maintain an individual and group safety, coordinate resources and relationships with the land, with animals, and beyond. And so we could get much deeper into that and talk about different theories around what is law, but we're not going to do that today. But we can use this definition to helpfully get us into what is Indigenous law. And so when we're talking about that, we are talking about the specific legal orders of Indigenous nations in Canada and beyond as well. They are among Canada's founding legal orders. They don't always get the attention as such, but these are alive, these are living legal orders, and they continue to grow and evolve and govern the affairs of Indigenous communities today. Our word for it in Mi'kmaq is Olnue de Budahan. And that just, Olnue is of the people, so you might hear Mi'kmaq, but we also use the term Olnu or Olnug, and it means people of the same tongue. And that's how we identify the people in our language. And de Budahan is the word for law. Yeah, in terms of what Indigenous law is, it is not Canadian law as it relates to Indigenous peoples. It is the laws of Indigenous people. So when we're talking about the Indian Act or Gladue, those are examples of Canadian laws that relate to Indigenous peoples. But here we're talking about Indigenous peoples' own laws. And we won't get into all in depth, but it is more than just restorative justice. Sometimes, you know, for a period of time when we began to, I would say in the 90s, 80s and 90s actually, sort of look at Indigenous peoples' control over their own affairs and started to talk about it. We primarily looked at it under the lens of restorative justice. It includes restorative justice or elements that look like restorative justice, but I would say that they're more nuanced than mainstream Canadian restorative justice. But they're more than that as well, and they're more than just customs and protocols. You know, sometimes there are some court decisions that often would just simply refer to them as customs or protocols. They have been impacted by colonialism, and so this is what the last bullet here is that Indigenous laws are alive, but they are not always intact or explicitly in use, and it will depend from community or from nation to nation and sometimes from community to community. And that is what necessitates the kind of work that Cheryl and I and many others across the country are doing in working with various resources of Indigenous law in order to revitalize them and to articulate them and to make accessible resources available for people to understand them and work with them from our own communities as well as broader society, in particular the legal system, the Canadian legal system. And so to get us a bit more into that, I like to use this sort of breakdown of the features of legal orders. Ghislain Otis is a law professor at the University of Ottawa. And I find this a very helpful breakdown because he's essentially done work looking at different legal orders across the world. He's a French speaker. He's primarily looked at jurisdictions where there are French-speaking colonies or ex-colonies. And looking at, but he's also done some English as well, but looking at the features of legal orders. And he basically says, you know, despite all their distinctions and differences, legal orders essentially contain 5 key features that across the board, which are values, principles, rules, actors, and processes. And I like this distinction, and I like to use it in the work that I do to kind of show when we are working with different resources of Indigenous law that we can work with them to pull out things like values, principles, and rules. Actors and processes, I think, are fairly self-explanatory, but I really like that our emphasis on what constitutes law, in fact, incorporates all of these things, not just black letter rules, for example. And really, the kind of work that we're doing is examining different resources of Indigenous law and doing this work to pull out Indigenous people's worldview, how they see the world, how we think about our relationships with various entities within the world, and translating them into practices, mores, normative standards. Okay, so just continuing on with Ghislain Otis's breakdown, is focusing on values, principles, and rules. They're all related to each other. So he describes values as a quality or characteristic deemed by a given community to be important or good, something we value. But a step up from that is a principle, which he describes as a reference standard based on values and on which it is appropriate to regulate an action or a conduct. It's a normative translation of an ideal embodied in a value. And the next step up from that is a rule. A specific prescription applied to a particular situation in order to give practical effect to a principle. So you can see they're related to each other. And the examples he gives is a group, neighboring groups practicing a subsistence lifestyle. And so you could say that the group, members of the group, have the value of respect for life. And so that value can, in certain circumstances, translate to the principle of sharing food, that it is important to share food resources when others may be in need of them. And that, in turn, he said, can be embodied into a rule, making it a requirement for a family or an individual to share their resources with another family if they may need it. So in this example, he says a family in need can invite themselves to the neighbor's more game-rich hunting territory in order to obtain food, and of course the neighbor obliging them and allowing that to happen. And so you see there how they're all interrelated. And so I like this a lot because in the work that I do with stories and language in particular, it's not always going to be a black letter rule that's going to come out or a protocol. And and a lot of people think that Indigenous laws are just customs and protocols. But there's so much more in there, and our stories and our language can show the values and the principles that are embedded in those things, and then those things can then be used by Indigenous peoples today to make written positive laws, to make decisions, to do any number of things in terms of governance and lawmaking. So, a couple lessons that I want to say on this is I've been referring to different sources of Indigenous law. And so, unlike, the Western legal system, I mean, we do have common law, but like many of our laws are written down in statute books. But we have, many sources of law. They're not necessarily written down, or many of them are not written down, but we have a lot that we can work with. We have the knowledge of elders and families and oral history, but we also have resources that could have been written down at some point. Stories that were told to perhaps a missionary priest by an Indigenous person in the 18th century or 17th century. We have these types of stories. We've got priests who wrote dictionaries. We have Indigenous peoples who are writing dictionaries today. We have recordings of songs and dances and practices, recordings or things that are passed down orally. Work happening with harvesting and quill work, working with material culture. This is what Cheryl's going to talk about shortly. And the land. The land is such an important source of law for Indigenous peoples, and there are various different ways that one can learn from and draw out law from the land. So and I could go on and on. There's even more than that. You see this long list. But there's a ton of work happening. And has been, I guess, probably now for 2 decades. John Burroughs, if you're interested in reading more, is one of the sort of leading scholars in this area, as has been Val Napoleon and Hadley Freeland. But under them, several more young Indigenous scholars and some non-Indigenous scholars too have been coming out and working in developing methodologies to work with these different resources of Indigenous law. And so if you're interested in knowing more about some of this different work and reading some of these, feel free to reach out to us. So that's just like a real quick snippet of this work. So I now want to get into more of the experiential sort of aspect of it. And what I'll do that is tell you about a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years. It's called Gluskabewimk, which means working with Gluskap and Gluskap stories. So for those of you not familiar with Gluskap, he is a central figure in the Mi'kmaq worldview. He was created in order to help the Mi'kmaq learn from the land, learn to respect the land and animals, and so he's just a massive figure. We have many landmarks and places that are named in his honor, and many, many stories about him. And so a project sort of trying to use some of the methodologies that I'd mentioned, specifically methodologies around using stories about Gluskap, as well as using language embedded in those stories and Mi'kmaq words related to those stories. I have been working with 4 organizations in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq organizations, coming together, and they have chosen about 20 people who would be very interested in sitting around talking about Gluskap stories. It's kind of, I refer to it as kind of like Mi'kmaq book club, because we get together every month or 2, and Cheryl's part of this too. We pick 3 Gluskap stories on a particular theme, and then we talk about them and we draw out principles, values from those stories and discuss them. So that's essentially the 3rd methodology that we're employing, which is what John Burroughs calls the deliberative method. Essentially, when people get around, talk with each other about, interpreting different principles. And so we do this in terms of working with the stories. And our partners, in fact, gave us this list of research questions, which basically covers everything. You're taking a look at it. What do our Glooscap stories tell us about leadership? What does it tell us about our relationship with the environment and four-legged? What do they tell us about procedures for collective decision-making, responding to harm? How do we treat the vulnerable? So it's about a 1.5-year project we're in so far, and it will probably go on for some time, but it's quite rich. And to support that work, we have been developing a database of Glooscap stories. We have about 80 in the database now, and we, in fact, sort of summarize the stories, but also categorize them in terms of the legal themes that they touch on. Because you can read a story kind of like you do a common law case, right? They touch on various different legal themes. And so we get students to work with us and to brief these into the database and then are pulling them out. We've done a few sessions. We did one on creation stories, and then we've also done work. We did a session back in February about greed, and did a few great stories that teach us about greed. And our hopes with this project is essentially to eventually use the reports that are coming out of each session with the participants and develop materials for communities to be able to use to pass laws, make decisions, whatever they want, but in order to give them their opportunity to work with materials. So how are we doing now? Okay. So I think we've got time with this. How are you doing? Okay. So I just wanted to give you, and this will go nicely into Cheryl's work, but so I wanted to do one creation story with you. So Julie was kind enough to sort of hand out this, and I'm going to read you the story, and then I'm going to ask you a question. So as I'm reading it to you, it's only 2 pages, I want you to think about what are the teachings. We have a much more elaborate framework we bring our group through when we do this, but this will give you a sense of what it's like, a little taste. But as I'm reading through it with you, identify what you think this one story, and there are many Mi'kmaq creation stories, this happens to be a very central one, but what are the values, principles, and rules as I'm reading through it do you think you see with respect to Mi'kmaq relationship with animals, land, and water? And we'll do a little bit of calling out after I'm done reading the story. So let's see how that goes. There we go. All right, so here we are. Story time. On the other side of the path of the spirits, in ancient times, Gizulk, the creator, made a decision. Gizulk created the firstborn, Niskam, the sun, to be brought across Eskadeta Mujawadi, the Milky Way, to light the earth. Also sent across the sky was a bolt of lightning that created Uksitkamu, the earth, and from the same bolt, Glooscap was also created out of the dry earth. Glooscap lay on Uksitkamu, pointing by head, feet, and hands to the 4 directions. Glooscap became a powerful teacher, a Ginap, a Buowan, whose gifts and allies were great. In another bolt of lightning came the light of fire, and with it came the animals, the vegetations, and the birds. These other life forms gradually gave Glooscap a human form. Glooscap rose from the earth and gave thanks to Gizulk as he honored the 6 directions, the sun, the earth, and then the east, south, west, and north. The abilities within the human form made up the 7th direction. Glooscap asked Gizulk how he should live, and Gizulk, in response, sent Nugami, Glooscap's grandmother, to guide him in life. Created from a rock that was transformed into the body of an old woman through the power of Niskam, the sun, Nugami was an elder whose knowledge and wisdom were unfolded in the Mi'kmaq language. Nugami taught Glooscap to call on Abistaneuch, the marten, to speak to the guardian spirits for permission to consume other life forms to nourish human existence. Marten returned with their agreement, as well as with songs and rituals. Glooscap and his grandmothers gave thanks to Gizulk, to the sun, to the earth, and to the 4 directions, and then feasted. As they made their way to understand how they should live, Glooskap then met Nedawansum, his nephew, whom Gizulk had created in his human form from the rolling foam of the ocean that had swept upon the shores and clung to the sweetgrass. Nedawansum had the understanding of the life and strength of the underwater realms, and he brought gifts from this realm to Glooskap, including the ability to see far away. They again gave thanks and feasted on nuts from the trees. Finally, they met with Nigana Degewisk, Glooskap's mother, a woman whose power lay in her ability to tell about the cycles of life or the future. She was born from a leaf of a tree, descended from the power and strength of Niskam, the sun, and made into human form to bring love, wisdom, and the colors of the world. As part of the earth, she brought the strength and wisdom of the earth and an understanding of the means of harmony with the forces of nature. They lived together for a long time, but one day Glooskap told his mother and nephew that he and his grandmother Nugami were leaving to go north. Leaving instructions with his mother, Glooskap told of a great council fire that would send 7 sparks, which would fly out of the fire and land on the ground, each as a man. Another 7 sparks would fly out the other way, and out of these 7 sparks would arise 7 women. Together they would form 7 groups or families, and these 7 families should disperse in 7 directions and then divide again into 7 different groups. Like the lightning bolts that created the earth and Glooskap, the sparks contained many gifts. The sparks gave life to human form, and in each human form was placed the prospect of continuity. Like Glooskap before them, when the people awoke naked and lost, they asked Glooskap how they should live. Glooskap taught them their lessons, and thus he is named one who is speaking to you, or the teacher creator. So that's just one of our creation stories, and there are many, many Glooskap stories that go on to tell. But, the framework that I have has questions like, do you have any questions that would help you sort of understand this better? But we don't have time for that. But what we do have, I would like to just sort of give you maybe an opportunity to sort of identify, if you had in that brief reading, some of what you think the story tells us about Mi'kmaq's relationship with the environment and with animals and water as well. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I noticed a lot in like this 1.5 pages, there was like 3 occasions where they threw thanks.
Absolutely, giving thanks, and actually some of it's required, right, from the marten about taking their life to eat, right? So there's rituals and ceremonies. Yeah, yes.
The focus is more on gifting
Yeah.
rather than exchange, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, less of a commodification, but gifts and responsibilities associated with gifts.
Connection between the human, the sun, the animals,
Yeah.
everything around them.
And related, right? They're kin and they're related to each other. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I just noticed, I thought it was interesting, and maybe it's his grandmother.
Yeah.
So I think the respect for elders that she gives the guy, she's female also.
Yeah.
Stood out to me.
Yeah, the role of grandmothers is so significant, and elders, and so, she's essentially Glooskap's first teacher, as the others. Yeah. Yeah.
Humans being of the earth, so stemming from the earth as opposed, and that interdependence, whereas in some other religious creation stories, it's, a god that made humans or man that made humans.
Yeah.
Not so much of the earth.
It's this lightning bolts and the sun
Yeah.
and made from dirt, right? And then sparks from the fire. But yeah, very much derived from the earth. And so many connections in that regard are built into the story. And yeah, this is such a quick, but we spend a significant amount of time sort of unpacking all of those things. But this just to give you a little bit of the taste of some of the work that we're doing. And we actually create legal frameworks based on discussions with, like, from the 3 creation stories that we read. We built frameworks sort of pulling out these principles, pointing to exactly where in the story they are coming out. I don't know, Cheryl, did you want to add anything to that? And I want to give you time to do your stuff.
This corner's a bit tricky.
Okay, well, I've got a couple more things to say then before we go to that. So that was just to give you a little taste of some of the work we do with stories, but we do it in a far more detailed way. But there's also work happening with language. And some of my work has been about how different, the aspects of Indigenous languages, how they can reveal law. And they do it in a variety of different ways. So I'll just give you a couple of examples that are linked to environment and our relationship with the greater world. So principles, so concepts in Mi'kmaq, you can call them meta principles or word bundles, but there are big sort of major concepts that essentially act like legal principles. There are many, and I think many more for us to discover. There are some that have, kind of been picked up, and even like in Nova Scotia's Sustainability Act, they have the word Nadugalimk, right, which is a very big concept, and I don't think I'm doing it justice by what I put on the slide here, but it speaks to our responsibilities to the, natural world, it should say. Sometimes people describe it as stewardship, but I was just looking over some of our conversations from one of our last sessions with the group, and somebody said, no, don't call it stewardship, because stewardship implies that we are somehow above nature as opposed to equal to it and working in relation to it. But anyway, so there's a lot to unpack with Nadugalimk. There's another law that's passed by my community about its relationship with lobster, and they have 4 key principles that they set out that they say has to be used to interpret the law, and one of them is ankoromuk, which means I take care of something in a careful way. So there are many, many legal concepts, and so work that we're doing sometimes looks at sort of unpacking what some big terms mean. There's also other cool things about even the grammar of our language that helps us understand our relationships more. So the primary category of how we conjugate verbs in Mi'kmaq, the grammatical category, in English and French it's gender. In Mi'kmaq it's animacy and inanimacy. So whether something is alive or not is the prime determinant of how we conjugate our verbs, and we have a far greater amount of things in Mi'kmaq that are in fact alive, viewed as animate. And so plants, rocks, certain mountains, certain geographical features are alive. And I think that kind of speaks to how even in our stories we see how there's such that connection between Mi'kmaq people and others. So there's a lot you can unpack from that. There's even more that you can look at. Our sort of concepts. Our words for colors are mostly associated with nature. Our months of the year are animate, and each has a special responsibility. Speaking back of Tom Cod, we have a specific month that is named, January is named for Tom Cod. That's when Mi'kmaq fished it, when they were mostly in need of food because the stores from the fall were running out, and they would rely on this special fish who would come up and spawn in the winter months for sustenance. And we have many, many names for places in Mi'kmaq that speak to our relationship. But I've taken up enough time, so I'm going to let Cheryl now move to some of her great work.
Oh, that's actually pretty good. So this transition slide is sweetgrass. And Naiomi and I actually were talking about all the different words that we have for sweetgrass. And I think people, especially in Canada, are most familiar with using it as a smudge. You go to ceremonies, people have it there, they cleanse, open mind, open heart, before you start work. But there's a lot more uses to it than that. So I wanted to talk about the creation of some Illinois or law that my community is going to be undertaking around sweetgrass. This is what it looks like when we braid it, as it is in the picture, for those of you who can see, thank you. And then we also, I keep some of mine flat because I use it for art. Because if you are familiar with it as a medicine, as cleansing, you might not be as familiar with it in terms of the role that it plays in our economy, the role that it plays in our artwork. And so that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about, because when you have an understanding and undertake harvesting practices in order to create art, which is what I'm making here today. The dean doesn't know this, but this is actually going to be a gift for the students at Schulich who graduate with a certificate in Aboriginal, is it a specialty?
Yeah,
a certificate. So they're going to get a print of this piece of work, to gift them in terms of the effort that they've put in. So it has a lot more role to play. When I was growing up, I most often saw it in basketry, and I have a little piece here that has it edged around a piece of basketry that I've used as a wall hanging, or these little brooms. And these brooms were often sold. People used them during the dark days of colonialism when they weren't able to have medicines in their home. They would have it as home decor. So when officials villagers came to visit, they saw this hanging on the walls and thought that it was just part of the decorations. So we sell it as such, but was also used as a way of keeping the medicines in the home and out of the eyes of the colonial authorities. So my family has used it a lot with basketry, which we sell. Right? Like it's a very sustainable art form, whether or not we're making baskets or this is porcupine quill work with the quills, mutated hair from a rodent that lives across North America. We dye them, we make beautiful patterns out of them. I flatter myself. But these days, I tend to focus a lot on having sustainable art because, you know, there's a lot of evolution in terms of contemporary art forms within Indigenous communities, but trying to focus on sustainable art, using materials that come off the land, harvested in the ways of my ancestors, that is what has fed into the project that I'm going to talk to you about today. So how's that for an opening based on one slide of sweetgrass? So this is my grandmother, Mary Jane. Whenever I think of sweetgrass, I think of her. So I wanted to share her image with you today and talk about the two concepts that Naiomi touched upon in terms of Nedigalim and Angodmug, which is the caring for something very deeply and the only taking what's needed. But the process of applying these two Indigenous legal principles in the Onoi de Blutaan is that you have to decenter the human with this. Because when we talk about you have to make sure that you only take what's needed, it's not just what humans need. What does the grass need? What are the animals that live on it? What about the ones that eat it? What about the ones, you know, the bugs? Everything that relies upon that item has to be considered. And then if those needs are met, in addition to the grasses and whatever you're harvesting from, if there then is a surplus, then you have to consider who within the community needs something from that. Are there elders that need it for making teas as medicine? Are there people that need it for their artwork in terms of making sure that they have it so they can sell during the winter months? All of those concepts go into just the harvesting of the sweetgrass. In addition to that, we use it as a teaching mechanism. Women's activity has largely gone, oh, I even hate to say this, knock on wood, uncontested when it comes to the evolution of Aboriginal law in Canada. We fly below the radar because our activities tend not to run up against industry. You know, people are not out commercially harvesting sweetgrass. We're not up against some of the big forestry companies, the fishing companies, that type of thing. So our activities, when it comes to gathering plants, tends not to have the same evolution in Aboriginal law and tends to be an example of something that's grounded much more in Indigenous law than what we're used to thinking about in terms of our harvesting practices. So these are all the things that my family actively teaches our youngsters. We use schools, the high schools, the local elementary schools, post-secondary. We take politicians out to show them what we mean when it comes to harvesting. And just that idea that it's a really deep-rooted component of caring for something. And there's so much science and understanding and knowledge. I probably am preaching to the choir with all of this in terms of the depth of Indigenous knowledge with land. But it does make up and has to be understood to fully understand these legal concepts that we talk about. And unfortunately, our laws in our jurisdiction weren't recognized fully enough to prevent damage to the environment, but we're now hoping to use them to help protect people from the effects of the climate change. Her name is Mary Jane Jadis, by the way. So the project that I'm working with now is located in Ebiguit, which is the Mi'kmaq word for this island, known in English as Prince Edward Island, here in the Atlantic region. Elsadukuk is the name of the actual, we call it a river. We're talking about the foreshore, basically. Ebiguit doesn't have the elevation for actual rivers, so everything we have are tidal estuaries. And as a result, I'm bragging. I find that we have some of the best sweetgrass out there because the oils really get to develop in that area with the salt water, and they really develop. We get really long grasses. Some of the ones on the prairies don't grow that as long. But I really, really, really like the sweetgrass that we get at home. It is the foreshore that this activity takes place on, and depending on which government you would talk to, they would say that there's different jurisdictions that are at play there in terms of who gets to control this. But again, and I recognize that we're being recorded, but this activity largely flies below the radar, right? So this is just the map. So the Hillsborough River in English flows by my community. But the river is not actually located within the reserve, so we are dealing with our traditional territory, our Indigenous laws and their application, and then the product that we harvest as a result. So when it comes to land-based learning, you have to learn about sweetgrass, in my opinion, out on the land. You have to be out there on those patches, smelling the oils that are in there, because every time the breeze blows, the grasses move, you smell them. You really embody the nature of these loss in terms of caring for them. So you'll also notice this picture here is actually a group of people that it's really actually only 4 of my apprentices with my art form, but then our family members who came along harvesting as well. So we always tend to do things in a collective manner, share the work. Everybody does their part because you're harvesting not just for yourself, you're harvesting for the broader community as well. And it's always intergenerational. One of the first teachings I got when I was pregnant and then had children was always take your children. You always, always, always take your children. And so this idea that we have to be able to conduct these activities in a place that is suitable for elders and for children, right? Like that's just a non-starter. And we also have to care for the patch. I very rarely take people, settlers, or people from the schools out to actually harvest, because my question to them is always, what are you going to do with it? Right? Like as an individual, if you go out and do something and you don't share a worldview and you're not perhaps sharing our activities, what are you going to do with that sweetgrass? Are we just going to go out and harvest and extract something for the purpose of showing you that like what you can do when that actually is just a tiny drop in the bucket in terms of our obligations and like the care that we have to show to this patch? So these days when I take people out, except for when they're actually going to be working with it like this picture, I take people out to help fertilize it. We go out, we check on it to see how the patch has weathered. There's been some hybridization within the grasses within this area that we're kind of keeping an eye on, the grasses from the woods versus the grasses that are coming up from the shore to see how that's going. But one of the things, I don't know if you noticed, how many people in this picture are actually sitting down? Right? There's a few of them, right? There's a few people that are sitting down. And that is the issue that actually led to this project that I'm working on, is how people actually physically occupied the patch. And so this caring responsibility, my grandfather always said, you always have to check after each big kind of major event in a natural area, like if there's a big storm that goes through, you have to go check up to see how things have weathered. In the springtime, you have to see how the area has like gone through the winter time, what does it look like? And my aunt, I actually had taken people out to fertilize in kind of like the later spring. She was living out in Alberta, didn't know that I was doing that. And so when she came out to check up on the patch, all she could see were these marks where people had spread out and walked through the grasses. You know that trail that you have when you walk through tall grass? She's like, somebody's been here. And then she's like, but they haven't been harvesting. What's going on? And everybody had spread out throughout the entire patch because they were helping me care for it during that time of year. So we really always are always looking after these patches. It's not just about going out to harvest. So this is a picture of myself with the grasses that I have harvested. There's a little picture of the broom. I forgot that I had this in my car, so I brought it in this morning in terms of it. But like I said, this actually is part of a sustainable and eco-friendly economy, right? In addition to our Aboriginal and treaty rights that go into making these pieces. So that is something that when we're talking about the preservation and the care of this resource, it goes from everything to your physical well-being, your mental well-being, and then what you're doing to earn a living off the land and interacting, your teaching mechanisms, your pedagogies with your children, learning from the older generation. It has a lot of medicinal purposes. I was actually going to make tea and to share with you what it tastes like, but then it really can cause severe allergies. It also reacts really badly sometimes with different medicines. There's a lot of different things with it. The legal mind with the liabilities, maybe that's not such a great idea. But you can make tea and you can drink it. And it was part of the medicines that my grandfather always made and were in the house. So I cannot stress enough how important this resource is to my community, to my family, and to how we interact with people that we now share our territory with. So this is the other side of the location. It's actually an old wharf, which is really, really good because of the fact it allows for easy access. And again, taking elders out, taking school children out, that is good. Like this is a real prime location. I personally have borne witness to 4 generations of my family using this area, in addition to all the other families within the community that have as well. But the Rising Tides project has come about because things are changing. And initially, we really noticed the difference after 2022 when Hurricane Fiona came through. We had noticed that there was higher water levels with it, but we were still able to sit when we were harvesting, right? The elders were still able to sit, harvest, and then kind of shuffle along a little bit. So we noticed the difference in the hybridization with the grasses. We noticed the difference that the waters are starting to get a little bit higher. But in 2022, things started to significantly change. And that is because when Hurricane Fiona came through, in this area, up to 80% of the trees were felled due to the force of the winds. So that has had a tremendous impact. And of course, we all know the stronger storms are a result of climate change. And so that caused great concern. And so, but of course we had to check, well, was it just because of the trees? Were there other issues going on? And so we really spent a lot of time, I was telling Naiomi about this, about double checking to make sure, is there any other explanation for this? We were checking the water levels at every phase of the moon. You know, as coastal peoples, we follow the lunar calendar very closely. And then not only were we tracking the moons, we were also looking at another world, the above world, in terms of the celestial events, right? Because we've had a lot of eclipses, we've had a lot of planetary alignment, that can have an impact on tides and water levels and all this type of stuff. And sure enough, none of that seemed to, like, yes, it had an effect, but it didn't seem to be the causation when those events weren't occurring in terms of the water level. So we have been left with climate change. Right, this is what it is. And like I said, we haven't been able to have our laws respected enough to prevent it, but now we have to try to mitigate the damage and the dangerous situations. So because Ebiguit we have no rocks. Those are imported rocks that you see as part of the old wharf. We have no rocks, and the nature of the soil with the clay. The reason why this is so dangerous is because when the water levels increase, it does in kind of little pockets that are spread throughout this patch of sweetgrass, and it creates these almost like a little bowl of softened area that are not easily identifiable if you're not paying close attention. So what can happen is you're walking through the grasses and all of a sudden you find yourself perhaps up to your chest height in a soil that feels like quicksand. Right? So imagine children, elders, you know, if you're by yourself, this can be extremely problematic and dangerous, right? And this is what we're concerned about. And so this project, we are looking to talk with people who use the riverfront, right, the foreshore, to determine like how many people are using it, what, like in terms of what can we do to mitigate the danger. And so we're going to be gathering that information, and the hope is that we can mitigate the danger such that we just regulate and change our behavior to make sure that perhaps from now on we'll only do it at the lowest of the low tides. You know, as opposed to having it just kind of whenever it's convenient for different groups. We always did it on like lower tides, right? And we don't go out in high tide. But to make sure, like, well, what's the cycle, like the lunar cycle again, to make sure that it's at the lowest it possibly can be if we're going to be taking groups out. The hope is that with that type of information, we'll be able to determine whether or not it's still safe to take these groups of people out, because it might limit then the number of people who have the knowledge necessary and know about those softer areas and what they're looking for in order to make it still use. Because we really don't want to give up this patch. We really don't. There are other areas along the estuary that have sweetgrass growing there, but they're harder to get to. You know, it's not like, it's just, this is just prime location with it. So we're really hoping that we don't have to abandon this site that we've used like for, you know, even just in my family, like I said, 4 generations with it. So that is what we're working on today. And one of the interesting things about this is, like I said, our jurisdiction has not been respected throughout the time, but we are also the gatekeepers as to the settlers who go out, because very few settlers use it for this purpose. People tend to have parties there. People use the river for like recreation, waterway, canoeing, kayaking, that type of stuff. But we haven't noticed people other than ourselves using the foreshore, which I won't lie, kind of blows my mind, because I was always taught that that is one of the most powerful places when land meets water in terms of what grows, and you know, it's just like a pharmacy, as my mom was saying. There's a lot of really good food there too. So anyway, so as a result, what we're hoping to do is that the Indigenous law then, because we're going to modify our behavior in terms of when we're bringing settlers out for that educational piece, that will help be a gatekeeper in terms of keeping people safe without having to deal with the broader public implications of saying, Mi'kmaq jurisdiction issues are full force, we're going to keep out settlers, right? Like that's a different fight to fight than trying to mitigate the danger and doing what we can as caretakers to make sure that the law is going to function via us to keep everybody that might be out there using this resource safe. So that is the nature of the project.
There you go.
I think,
I mean,
is that
it's
the last
transparent.
slide? Or is that
Is that it?
Okay. I always end, because I do a lot with porcupine quills, this is the rodent's butt. So whenever I'm ending a PowerPoint, I always end it that way. So in case you're wondering what that is, that's why that's there. The day I stop laughing at it, I'll stop doing it, but I haven't yet. So does anybody have any questions about the project or the methodologies and projects that Naiomi is working on? Yeah.
David?
You talk about the relationship of Indigenous law with environmental law and
Yeah.
environmental law. I mean, two principles really stand out outside of Indigenous law: ecosystem approach, definition of it, and then precautionary approach.
Mm-hmm.
Probably two most fundamental, both international and also national. And I guess, again, your research came out right in the information story, a bit of, I think, the
Yeah.
ecosystem approach.
Yeah.
But again, how deep is that? And again, when I look at the future, can we begin to look at Indigenous law with state practice, and really the whole social practice have to come back into that equation of what we consider custom, for example.
Cheryl, you want to start with that one?
I don't
Cheryl's
know
always
why-
saying, like, if they would just apply Indigenous law, this wouldn't be a problem.
We had this all figured out. The sea ice, nature as an entity. We have issues regarding the recognizing and implementing the autonomy of animals, how that works out and is sustainable for thousands and thousands of years. We have so many of these answers. But the problem is the jurisdiction, right? Will the state actually be willing to admit that there's some jurisdictional issues that need to be respected? They need to let things go and be supportive as opposed to trying to do it. Like this idea that are we using Indigenous law to expand the common law to meet our purposes in a very fast changing environmental disaster? Or are we actually going to recognize Indigenous jurisdiction and let these laws function the way that they have and have proven to be successful? And those are two different solutions to problems, but we tend to get people wanting and being drawn more to expanding the common law, in my opinion. I have to stay humble. That's also one of our lessons, right?
All right.
Just going to say, I think there's some really important conversations, right, to have. And so I'm really grateful to both of you, to my wonderful colleagues, Naiomi Vitalik, Cheryl Simon, who are both professors here. Thank you so much. And yeah, there's just a lot.
Yeah. You got
And
a
I'm really grateful to you guys, yeah, for sharing all of this with us. And we're going to take 10 minutes, 5 minutes? 2 minutes? No, we wanted more than 2 minutes. 5 minutes or so break, I think partly because there are going to be some other people joining us, or at least maybe some of those people have already joined us, but I just want to make sure that anybody who's outside has a chance to come in, and then we'll move on to our wonderful keynote speaker. So thanks so much, you guys.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay.